Good evening, everyone. I wanted to welcome you to tonight's webinar on restorative justice implementation, aligning trauma-sensitive and restorative justice practices. My name is Dawana Nicole. I'm with Advancement Project, and we are one of 5 organizations who make up the Restorative Justice Partnership. Our other partners are the National Education Association, Denver Public Schools, Denver Classroom Teachers Association, and Padres y Jóvenes Unidos. We are joined this evening by Lindsay Lee, who's the project manager of the Restorative Justice Partnership, and Joe Walden, who is a social worker at Skinner Middle School. As usual, our webinar is being recorded. Lindsay, did you have an opening for us?
Yes, ma'am, I do. So our opening, anything that's human is mentionable, and anything that is mentionable can be more manageable. When we can talk about our feelings, they become less overwhelming, less upsetting, and less scary. The people we trust with that important talk can help us know that we are not alone. And that is from Mr. Fred Rogers.
Thank you, Lindsay. So this is a very important topic, trauma-informed care, trauma-sensitive and restorative justice practices. And as a disclaimer, I do want to just acknowledge that I was actually very nervous about offering this webinar and accompanying resources around the alignment of the two. And not because I think that these are important topics to discuss and that they don't go well together, but far too often when we talk about trauma-informed care in schools, what I have seen in my experience is that we often look at the children from a deficit model, and that's something that needs to be fixed. We need to fix these children without acknowledging and doing the work around some of the systemic and institutional barriers that are put in place that actually traumatize young people to begin with, like systems of oppression and racism. And so I know that Joe and Lindsay are going to take very good care of that this evening as they talk about how to align restorative justice and trauma-informed care. Also acknowledge the fact that oftentimes our young people come to school and the trauma that they experience in their life is something that happens at school, either with increased police presence on campus or educators who are not supportive and loving when that is what young people need. And so I just hope that we all kind of keep that in mind, the different ways that both young people experience trauma and the trauma that adults have that may be unresolved and how that sometimes affects young people within school buildings. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lindsay and Joe. As a reminder, we will take questions at the end of the webinar. If you are calling in to the webinar, unfortunately, there is no way that I can take you off of mute and call on you. And so you can email me your questions. You should each have my email address because that is how the webinar was sent out. Or if you know me personally, you can send me a text message. Otherwise, if you are online, you can type your questions into the question box and we will take all questions at the end. Lindsay?
Thanks, Dawana. So I just wanted to start off by just giving a little bit of introduction about my history with education and working with trauma, and then Joe is going to do a little bit of the same. So we are both licensed clinical social workers, and my experience comes from working with survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence, substance abuse, severe and persistent mental illness. And then I spent 3 years as a school social worker in New Orleans, where 100% of the school populations that I work with received free and reduced lunch, and over 90% were impacted by trauma. So we know that because of doing universal screening throughout those school buildings. And that number includes students who endorsed exposure to at least one traumatic event. So personally, I tried to advocate for restorative justice in those individual buildings, but the administration really wasn't interested and the resources were not available. And then I moved into a position working with a nonprofit that offered group and individual trauma counseling to schools. There I became a director of military and restorative programs for almost 3 years before taking this position. as project manager. So before I wrote a grant for a restorative program that was trying to help supplement the trauma services and the work with military families, I was providing trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy to a student who had lost his mother the previous year. And we built rapport and followed the treatment plan as I had been taught to. And then when I returned to the school after the first session where we worked on actually processing the trauma, he refused to leave the class, sat down in the hallway with several school staff members present, trying to convince him to come with me. He said he was all better and didn't want to talk to me anymore. And then when I actually expressed my feelings authentically about the impact of what was going on, feeling frustrated and embarrassed and sad, and I engaged him with the restorative questions around just what had happened for him, he expressed that he agreed that he would at least have a brief conversation and expressed that he hadn't wanted to come because we'd only ever talked about his problems. And now that he knew I had feelings too, he felt like he could talk to me. So that moment really was a realization for me about the importance of authenticity in relationship with young people and the connection between restorative strategies and trauma work.
Hi, everyone. My name is Joe, and as Lindsay mentioned, I'm also a licensed clinical social worker. I, through all of my profession, have been working with young people who have experienced significantly impacted backgrounds of abuse and neglect. That was well before the term trauma-informed care had been coined. I mostly worked at the middle school level, but have had the experience of working with elementary age students and also of working with young adults and high school age students. My introduction to restorative practices work occurred when I had the opportunity of working over in Kenya, East Africa, with young men from Baltimore City who were in their 7th and 8th grade, who had the opportunity to go to Kenya to attend boarding school over there, to have an international experience, and to get them shored up academically, so that then when they return to the Baltimore City high schools, they'd have a better chance of graduating. So we used the restorative model very strongly over there in kind of the traditional sense, in terms of if kids would do something pretty heinous, they would end up being sent away from the community and sent into another community for care. But sometimes the community that they were sent to was a community that didn't necessarily speak their language. All of our boys were English speakers. But anyway, I found the model to be very, very positive and impactful in terms of building empathy and giving students an opportunity to see a different view than their own view. So that's a little bit about me. We want to talk a little bit about our objectives for our webinar this evening. And before we do, I want to go over a definition of trauma. And this definition comes from a curriculum called Risking Connection, and that curriculum was published in 2000. And the authors of that curriculum defined trauma as the unique individual experience of an event or enduring conditions in which the individual's ability to integrate his or her emotional experience is overwhelmed, and the individual experiences a threat to life, bodily integrity, or sanity. It's important to be aware that similar events can affect different people in completely different ways, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. So our objectives for tonight are to understand the alignment of our goals underlining trauma-sensitive and restorative practices, and to operationalize how restorative justice practices can help alleviate the impact of trauma symptoms.
All right, so anyone who has been through any kind of trauma training has almost certainly been exposed to the ACEs study, which are adverse childhood experiences, but it really remains the best place, I think, to start any discussion about the impact of traumatic experiences. So The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study is the groundbreaking research started in 1995 that first showed the prevalence and relevance of childhood trauma on health outcomes and engaging in risky behaviors later in life. So there's 3 categories of adverse childhood experiences, which we can see on this infographic. So those are abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. Abuse being physical, emotional, or sexual, neglect being physical or emotional, and household dysfunction including mental illness, an incarcerated relative, mother treated violently, substance abuse, and divorce. I don't know why that took me a second. So over half of the respondents to this study reported exposure to at least one ACE, and 1/4 reported exposure to 2 or more. Compared to those who reported no exposure, those who reported experiencing 4 or more ACEs had greatly increased health risks such as alcoholism, drug abuse, obesity, depression, and suicide attempts. There's a graded relationship between exposure to ACEs and the presence of adult diseases such as heart disease, cancer, chronic lung disease, skeletal fractures, and liver disease. Adverse childhood experiences are strongly interrelated, and participants who reported multiple categories of childhood exposure were likely to have multiple risk factors later in life. The ACEs study raised public awareness about the prevalence and impact of these experiences in childhood and helped to redefine the public's understanding of links between exposure to adversity and mental and physical outcomes of high morbidity and mortality. It's important to note that many childhood experiences are not included, such as exposure to community violence, school or mass violence, bullying, poverty, and racism. And many of these are a direct result of the larger systems of oppression that permeate our society and by definition enter into our educational system in a variety of ways. So awareness is helpful, but not sufficient to meet the needs of children and adults who have been exposed to these adverse experiences.
I think it's also important to point out that we haven't really figured out how individuals experience similar situations, and one develops trauma symptoms and the other develops resilience. There isn't a predictable reaction to trauma. I know there's research in regard to that, but we don't have the answers yet. It's also important to make sure that we're not judging what does or doesn't traumatize someone. It's important to be aware that again, the 2 people can experience the same thing, and if one person is overly traumatized by it, we shouldn't judge them for having a harder time with it. Or if someone is seemingly unaffected, we shouldn't judge them for kind of skating through if they're able to go through the process being unscathed. It's also important to understand the difference between empathy and sympathy. Empathy is when you're working to understand another's situation and using that understanding to respond with care. Sympathy is when you're feeling bad for someone. You're feeling bad for someone else. One of the things that's important to be aware of with sympathy is that sympathy also usually creates a power dynamic. Oh, you poor thing. You make a comment like that, that kind of places you above the person who has experienced whatever negative thing they've experienced that has impacted them. So it's important to kind of keep ourselves in check in terms of, am I displaying and am I embodying empathy, or am I displaying and embodying sympathy? And empathy is the preferred response.
All right, so we know that trauma impacts how we view the world. And a person who has experienced trauma often comes to see the world from the perspective of the trauma. So other people are untrustworthy and cannot be depended on. The world is an unsafe and unpredictable place where bad things happen and they are responsible. The future is something to be feared. In general, things are hopeless and uncontrollable. And this worldview helps us to contextualize the behaviors that can make individuals difficult to engage.
So I'm going to tell you a little bit about a young man that I worked with a couple of years ago. He came from a home that where there was a lot of neglect. He saw his mom being treated pretty harshly in some pretty extreme domestic violence, first by father and then by a number of boyfriends. The family experienced a significant amount of homelessness off and on. The student actually entered school in first grade already having a tough time following directions, having a lot of aggression towards his peers, and having a very, very difficult time focusing. As he went through his schooling through elementary school and then entered our school at the middle school level, he really started to display a pervasive and sad affect. His reactions to very, very typical events were really, really extreme. We saw a lot of withdrawal from him, a lot of avoidance of social interaction, a lack of his own personal care. He demonstrated consistent patterns of aggression, both with his peers and with the adults that were around him, and just a very pervasive kind of oppositional behavior and very, very limited self-control. Would be very, very, and he was a really, really difficult student to engage with because he did not trust the motives of the people around him who were trying to build relationship with him. His father was incarcerated. One of the things that we found out as we were doing a reevaluation for his individualized education plan, which he was diagnosed as having a learning disability, was in an interview with his mother, we ended up finding out that a friend of the family had been murdered, and that it was another friend of the family who had been responsible for the murder. And then off the record, mother reported to us that she was actually arrested in front of her son for being an accomplice to the murder. And so this young man was just living with a shoulder full of trauma, and it was trauma upon trauma. One of the things that was really helpful for our staff members was in the beginning, we were just seeing his behavior, and it was hard to know what was going on, what was creating the behavior. As we found out more about this young man's history, the staff were able to build kind of better empathy paths towards this young man. And the thing that built the big empathy path was when they found out that his mother had been arrested as an accomplice, and although her name was cleared, it was still a traumatic event for the young man because his mother, one, was implicated in the murder of a friend, and two, she actually spent some time in jail away from the young man. So I just bring up that case in terms of how the numbers of traumatic events that sometimes our students experience, and one of the things that we've discovered with our staff here at our school is that the more they know about a person's experience, particularly in regard to trauma, a lot of times the more they're able to muster up the empathy to be able to respond, so that it's not just about responding to the behavior, but it really is about responding to the kind of the whole child in the big picture.
All right, so where restorative justice comes in terms of our trauma sensitive. So Joe, you're going to start us off on that one.
Okay. Sorry about that. Yeah. So one of the things that's important when you're a restorative school, a restorative school should be inherently trauma sensitive. Now, one of the things that all of the trauma-informed care literature tells us is to be considered a trauma-informed care school and a trauma-sensitive school, the entire faculty need to be trained in regard to what it means to be trauma sensitive. But but the kind of our base definition of a restorative school that is trauma sensitive is it's about building a supportive community, and in that supportive community there is trust that within the students or from the students, the trust is created so that students know that the community is there as a source of support and of strength. A restorative school gives voice, which is empowering, and that's a really, really important piece in terms of the resolution of trauma, is being able to have voice. And it also gives hope that there can be movement towards resolution. So I don't have to be stuck in this one place. So the restorative approach and the trauma sensitive, so many of the values are so similar to each other.
And so also in a restorative school, relationships are centered throughout the school community. And this is going to be a theme that we'll be talking about quite a bit throughout the next hour. So, and educators as well as students are encouraged to share their experiences and needs in order to create a positive and safe environment. Kind of going back to that story that I shared earlier, it was so important that I be authentic and in relationship and able to share my authentic experience. Like that is really crucial. Also, the restorative mindset informs the lens and the tools that are used throughout the classroom and the larger school building. Triggers are avoided and basic supports are provided for the majority of community members. And then those that need higher level services are identified, they're supported, and provided opportunities to seek treatment either through the school or external providers. Because I think it's important to remember that both being restorative and being trauma sensitive or healing centered, none of those things mean that all educators are meant to be mental health professionals, or that they're able to address the needs of every single student, especially those or educators that need those higher level trauma treatment. But just that for the most part, it's a relationship centered, it's a safe environment, and we're not triggering the members of our community. So when we talk about that higher level treatment, trauma treatment relies on creating new coping skills prior to engaging in trauma processing. We can't ask an individual to intentionally engage with or reprocess a traumatic memory without first providing them new tools to support this. So the behavior that the individual engages in response to exposure are working for them to some degree. So whether that's avoidance or aggression or dissociation, any of those things, the skills that they have, the coping that they have is working. And so we need to give them something that works better before we can really expect them to engage with the trauma. Restorative dialogue allows for individuals to identify the coping skills that they need in order to be successful throughout the day, and also gives them voice throughout that process. And again, that can be either student or educator being able to advocate for themselves in terms of what they need to be successful.
Right, and many people who've been traumatized don't necessarily have the language or the communication skills to express or process what they've experienced. We certainly experience that with our youth here at school. One of the great things about restorative work is that restorative work is about giving people voice, and particularly when you are doing circles, it can be really powerful for a person who maybe is very comfortable kind of being a wallflower, to hear other people share their experiences, and not necessarily experiences of trauma, but to communicate and share their experiences. But it also is helpful in a circle where when the talking piece comes around, that the person has an open door, an open window, to be able to share something that they want to share. And again, we're not necessarily talking about circles that are focused specifically on trauma, but just the piece around restorative work is it helps people communicate what it is that they're thinking and feeling. And as people are communicating what it is that they're thinking and feeling, just in terms of like everyday life and what goes on, the hope is eventually they will feel more comfortable talking about maybe uncomfortable experiences that that they've been a part of. The other, and well, so I guess the other piece is that I think that it also, what we notice with our kids is that it just explicitly teaches communication skills that eventually allow the trauma processing to happen. That kids will hear maybe someone talking about something that has negatively impacted them, and again, as they see someone modeling that, then they pick up the language, and a lot of times then will follow the similar process. And so the voice that restorative work gives to everyone involved can be really, really healing for those who have experienced traumatic events and situations in their lives.
So not all trauma students experience takes place outside of school. Young people can be traumatized by interactions with educators, police in schools, and institutional racism. Undesirable behaviors can be triggered in response to trauma that occurs in the community, in the home, and or in the school building. Additionally, educators facing their own unresolved traumas can impact how they show up in the workplace.
It's important to be aware that some of the responses in trauma may be really invisible to staff members and to other students, but students may manifest different things during the day, maybe difficulty sleeping, which could result in being short-tempered, maybe anxiety that results in, well, and actually from a teacher standpoint, you know, teachers come into the classroom sometimes with anxiety, sometimes anxiety about the classroom, but they sometimes come in with anxiety that they're bringing in from home. And when that happens, sometimes a teacher's reaction can end up being from the teacher's frame of reference from their own trauma. I had mentioned empathy a little bit earlier, and one of the things that's really important to be aware of in regard to empathy is that empathy is the desired response that we want for our children. But one of the things that we need to be careful with is making sure that we're not over-identifying with the student's situation, and making sure that we're kind of keeping ourselves in check so that we're not using the students to kind of resolve our own trauma.
So just diving a little bit deeper into kind of what you have on the screen, it is essential for educators to examine their responses to student behavior in the context of their potential biases and unresolved personal trauma. So some of the signs of unresolved trauma in adults can include anxiety or panic attacks in what could be considered normal situations. I know a lot of us have experienced those things. It can be avoidance of people, places, things, or unpleasant emotions, whether that's associated with the trauma or not. It can be, as Joe mentioned, trouble falling or staying asleep. It can be feelings of detachment, feelings of needing to be on guard, inability to tolerate conflict, or uncontrollable anger and acting on that anger. And I think when you look at that list of symptoms, it makes a lot of sense how when our educators lash out at students or become triggered by things that happen in the classroom, that it makes sense that those symptoms would link to the trauma that they might have experienced. I know at a school that I worked with, a teacher walked out of the school, resigning the position because a student whistled. And that was really the only anticipating factor that happened. So it was a kind of a surprise to everybody in a situation where there definitely was something going on beyond, that student had not intentionally caused their teacher to, or caused the educator in their class to resign and leave the school forever. So.
One of the things that's important to be aware of, particularly if you are a circle keeper and doing circles, is that sometimes some of the discussions during either a circle or in a restorative process may trigger a participant's thoughts or feelings related to past traumatic experiences. and those can sometimes manifest themselves in behaviors that come up during the circle or during the restorative process, but they also could just trigger sometimes strong feelings. And it's important that that the circle keeper or the restorative practices coordinator works with the person in that moment to make sure that that the person is staying still feeling emotionally safe. Doesn't necessarily mean diving into the trauma, but it does. It's important to make sure that care is being provided to the person who maybe has been triggered. That's all I need to say about that, I think. So one of the things that apologies as a go-to resolution are not trauma informed. So it's really important that that we not go to the, oh, I need to say I'm sorry to someone because of something that I have done with them. That's not something that ends up helping the person who has experienced trauma.
And also that with those, a lot of times, a person who has experienced a traumatic relationship is used to an apology that is continued by the same behavior continuing. And so forcing someone to apologize for a behavior when it's not coming from them as a resolution or a way that they want to make things right, then that's just going to lead into that, you know, the apologies are meaningless, and this really isn't something that that means anything. All right, so now we are going to do a deeper dive into some of the behaviors that you might see in the classroom and what some potential restorative responses could be for those. So Joe is going to start us off with declining academic performance.
Right. So and that's usually kind of the first thing that we start to see after a student has experienced some kind of traumatic event. It's really important that when that goes on, that we engage in a conversation regarding the change that we've noticed. And so we check in with the student. You know, the dialogue may be, you know, hey, I've noticed that you're not putting as much effort or energy into your classwork or into your homework. Is there something going on? One of the things that I like to do is build a little compliment in there, and sometimes say, you know, this isn't the student that I'm used to seeing. That I noticed that you usually like put your all into things, and right now something's going on that's shifting that. And so just checking out with the student, like what's happening, what's going on? Can you tell me about this? Can you tell me about this shift? It's also one of the things that's also a good idea. If sometimes the conversation alone is enough to kind of start shifting the behavior, and that conversation that shift can particularly happen if there's a really strong relationship between the person, the teacher talking to the student and the student. And at times we'll actually have, if the particular teacher doesn't necessarily have the strong relationship, we sometimes will pick the person in the building who does have the strongest relationship to have that conversation with the student. Sometimes that's enough, and the academic effort kind of starts to shift a little bit. Obviously, if a student reports that they have experienced some trauma or some upsetting event, it then opens the door for the staff member to find the right supports, either to be the right support for the person or to find the right support for the person so that the student can start working through whatever it is that's going on. Another possibility would be to develop some kind of individualized plan for the student. Sometimes we have some students at our school who really like to be on point sheets, and they're point sheets that kind of measure how they're doing in class in terms of engaging with the class process, showing respect to others, getting their work done, staying focused, and the kids really like that immediate feedback. Brain breaks are always good in terms of kids can get up and go get a drink of water, or sometimes just standing up and stepping behind your chair, having a little bit of movement can be good. And then I think the other thing is if someone's working with the student around building some individual skills around self-advocacy and personal accountability.
So another common behavior that can be associated with trauma is hypervigilance, which manifests as being always alert, very concerned about safety, restless, or easily startled. And some restorative ways to handle that is to just establish those clear and predictable expectations and routines. Recognize when the student needs to de-escalate and allow time for that to happen. Again, supporting that self-regulation. So you notice in all of these, there's a lot of giving the student voice and power in terms of how to manage their own, their own behavior and reactions. And I mean, that's a good skill for all students, but especially those that are coming in with those extra needs. One practice that comes from our model elementary school here in Denver is starting each day with a whole class body scan. And that is something that one of the third grade teachers implemented, and now the students ask for it because a lot of them recognize that, when they're able to take that time to really see what's going on in their own body at the start of the day, it helps them to head off where they might be heading into a conflict or where they might be heading into not having a good day. So they really have come to rely on that body scan. And then, of course, our pretty basic connect before you direct. So just anytime you're having an interaction with a student that is going to end up in some kind of direction or correction, that you just connect the kind of the same way that Joe is saying, to add in a little compliment or just, hey, those are some great shoes. Do you want to tie them? Something as basic as that, just to make sure you're building that relationship before you're asking them to change that behavior.
Other behaviors that we might see would be avoidance of tasks, maybe avoidance of places, avoidance of people that involve too much stimuli or reminders of the trauma, and elopement, where kids are leaving the classroom without permission. And some of the possible restorative responses in regard to those behaviors are to provide an opportunity to identify potential triggers in the context of a safe and supportive relationship. Again, that kind of checking out, like, what's going on? Can you tell me what you're feeling? Can you tell me what just happened? Something I will say to the kids, something just triggered you or caused you to shift from what you're doing. Can you tell me what happened for you? It's important to create space for the students so that they feel heard and that they feel understood. And the focus should be on resolution and on healing whatever wound it is that's going on with the student.
Okay, so the aggression piece, where we have that argumentative behavior, anger, and outbursts, those are, I think, a lot of times those are our high flyers, the students that educators identify as the ones that really make their days more challenging. So again, this is super important, that when you have a student who is escalated, is argumentative, is angry, you have to de-escalate first. And something that Joe mentioned to me when we were planning for this is that when we're escalated, we lose up to 30 points of our IQ, and we lose our cognitive capacity to filter communication. So if we're engaging in restorative dialogue when someone is still escalated, that's pretty much futile, right? So de-escalation strategies have to be used prior to any of these restorative approaches. So after you have gone through those de-escalation strategies with that student, you can engage in a restorative dialogue to determine the root cause of the behavior, both from educator and student. You can connect individually to provide context and suggest appropriate responses. Establish reintegration processes that welcome students back after needing to leave the classroom, and provide an opportunity to repair any harm caused. So I had a situation with a student who had experienced trauma and was in the middle of an angry outburst triggered by not being able to draw a fleur-de-lis as well as he wanted to. And that escalated to the point of the student throwing chairs and really endangering the safety of the rest of the class. And so me being a very new restorative practitioner, I was trying to have that restorative conversation in the moment and realizing that that was not the best strategy in terms of getting him back. And so we ended up identifying or asking the dean to push into the classroom to help kind of calm him down. And she happened to be his first grade teacher. And so when she came in, he immediately started to calm down. He was able to, she allowed him that time to de-escalate. They had the restorative conversation in the classroom, and he immediately started to make it right by returning the chairs under the desks and putting the classroom back together. And all that was needed in that was the relationship with that other person, because me as an outsider, I was not the person that could engage him and get him back from that emotional, that escalated state.
Other behaviors that we might see are withdrawal. That's or difficulty fitting in socially or maintaining meaningful connections with others. Sometimes there's a sense of apathy, and again, the problem with difficulty expressing oneself and using language to express whatever it is that's gone on. And some possible restorative responses to that are, one, to make sure that we're creating intentional and dedicated time for relationship building between educators and peers. One of the things that we do at the beginning of the school year as a proactive piece is we really try to spend the first several days of school with the students in the classrooms working at building kind of mini classroom communities where the students are getting to know each other, the students are getting to know their teacher, the teacher's getting to know the students, but working at really fostering and building those relationships between each other. It's also important to try to regularly engage in circle processes with opportunities for all the students to participate. That can be in regard to conversations that are about a variety of things, but they can also be in regard to things that have to do with an academic content. We found quite a bit of success with our students who are using circles to reinforce academic content, and there's a lot of relationship building that can happen there and trust building that happens as well. It's important to establish norms of equal voice and shared values. I met with a student earlier today and asked a couple questions, and the student then said to me, "Can I ask you a question?" And I said, "Sure." And of course, when that happens, you never know what you're going to get. But the question was very appropriate. And the student said, "Why do you like to work in schools?" And so we had a nice conversation about that, which led to a conversation about what kind of degree I had and what kind of training it took to get to the degree and to the work that I do now. One of the other things that is a great way to try to connect with kiddos, particularly with the kiddo who is, this works for kiddos who are withdrawn, but it also can work with kiddos who might be particularly oppositional or difficult. But there's a strategy called the 2-10 strategy. And what the 2-10 strategy is you make a commitment that for 2 minutes a day, for the next 10 days, you are going to have a conversation with the student that you're having a difficult time connecting with in regard to something completely unrelated to school. So for 10 days, I'm going to devote 2 minutes each day to a conversation with this student or that student in regard to something completely unrelated to school. Kids are usually really caught off guard, particularly if they're having a hard time connecting. They're usually really caught off guard when someone wants to have a conversation with them in regard to something outside of school. And it's really, really important that whatever they present, that you work to engage with them in the conversation. I don't know how it is for the rest of you across the country, but right now the engageable conversation seems to be around the video game Fortnite. So I'm not a gamer, and so I really have to stretch myself in terms of engaging in those conversations. But today I was having a conversation with a group of kids that are a little bit difficult sometimes to connect with, and I just started off with, what's your favorite Halloween candy to get? And as soon as we did a kind of a whip around in regard to that, the students were just completely ready to get on with the activity of the class. So anyway, so the more you get to know about them, and the more you try to understand their world, the more likely they are to let you into theirs and to open up. And Lindsay, in her opening, talked about how that worked between she and a student when she presented some of her authentic self.
So lastly, we have engaging in high-risk behaviors, which are the substance use or abuse, reenacting traumatic experiences, recklessness, and self-injury. And the restorative responses that that could potentially be used for this is offering engagement with trusted adults and or peers to facilitate appropriate disclosure. And here I really want to highlight the importance of using peer mediators. Here at Skinner, we have a new group called the Restorative Justice League, which will be the topic of a future webinar. And there has already been a situation where a student was self-harming and was not willing to disclose to an adult. And so one of the Restorative Justice League members was used to, that doesn't sound right, but was tapped to intervene with that student to have that conversation, and she was able to facilitate that student feeling comfortable enough to bring her concerns to an adult who could take the appropriate action. So just making sure that you have those structures and those mechanisms in place to allow peers to really step up and take ownership of those relationships, and making sure that they're able to facilitate that. So then again, after that disclosure, you have to have, and there's a need for the arranging for appropriate referrals to higher level intervention. So whether that's mental health supports within the school or external providers, but just making sure that you know what your next steps are and what resources are available in the community to support those things. Because again, we're not asking all educators to be experts in all of these really heavy topics that are coming into the building. And then allowing the young person to participate in identifying their needed supports and solutions, because oftentimes they're going to come back from, if they are seeking additional treatment, they're going to come back with some new skills and new strategies that it would benefit them to be able to advocate for the use in the classroom. Any last thoughts on any of this, Joe? All right, so our last slide here really is just around the shared values between restorative and trauma-sensitive or healing-centered practices. And those shared values are relationship, safety, trust, and empowerment, and transparency. And just to note that transparency here is a value at the systems or process level, not at the individual level. There's no expectation that an individual educator or youth be transparent about the details of their traumatic experience. So this is just that we're transparent about how we're using these practices and processes and strategies. And then I also just wanted to note that the list that we just went through in terms of common behaviors associated with trauma and the responses is not comprehensive or exhaustive by any means. It's just kind of a starting point to use as a tool. So when you're feeling stuck with a young person or with a peer, with an educator, that you have some strategies to try and lean on. But any response that centers relationship building and the individual's needs can be restorative.
Right. So one of the things that I think is also important to, so Lindsay asked me if I had any last minute thoughts, and I said no, but here I do. So one of the things that I think is also important to be aware of is that folks who have experienced trauma should engage in some kind of clinical process with someone in regard to resolving the trauma. And restorative practices is not a clinical practice. It can be healing and it can be therapeutic, but it is not a clinical practice. And it's really important that circle keepers and those who are facilitating restorative dialogues and conversations with folks not enter into turning either a restorative process, well, not turning the restorative process into a therapy session. And so it's very, very important that there be a kind of a clear distinction with that, and that can be a tricky line to follow when you're in the middle of something. But it's important that that be at the forefront of any facilitators or circle keepers' mind, so that you don't cross into that area where it's turning into a therapy group or turning into more of a clinical dialogue that where the circle keeper gets themselves in deeper than they have the expertise. And although I have the clinical training, I'm very, very clear that when I'm doing circles, the circle work is not about clinically engaging with the participants. That they're very two different things, but they do complement. Again, the restorative work and the trauma-informed care practices complement each other, but we just have to be careful that we're not crossing the line into it becoming clinical work.
So that is everything we had prepared for y'all today. So I hand it back over to Joanna to see what questions there are.
Thank you, Lindsay and Joe, for an incredibly informative webinar. Okay, so we are now going to take questions. Again, if you are online, then you can, or if you're using your computer or if you're using your smartphone, you can type in your questions in the question box. If you are just calling in, there's no way that I can call on you. And so if you have a question, you can email me. My email address is dnicole@advancementproject.org, or if you have my phone number, you can text me your question. So I did get a couple emails while you all were talking. And so, Joe, can you actually, Lindsay, you mentioned a lot about, you both kind of talked about, like the supports that are kind of necessary in schools when someone wants to unpack their trauma, like what mental health supports or behavioral health supports are available in schools. Joe, can you talk a little bit about what support positions are available in your particular school, just in general, just so folks have an idea? You're the social worker, but are there any other positions in the school or within the school district that that would kind of allow for the deep unpacking of some of the trauma that we're seeing in schools?
Sure. Yeah, so I'm here full time, and because I come from a clinical background, I'm able to engage with some kids in regard to traumatic experiences and help them do some processing in regard to that. We also have at our school, we have this year we have two master's level social work interns who are here to learn, but also provide great services to our students. We have a school psychologist 2 days a week who's able to provide some services. We also have a substance abuse prevention and intervention specialist, and although her responsibilities are specific to prevention and intervention services related to substance use, she's able, when there is time, she's able to step in and work with students who are struggling in some way. Each school really gets to kind of determine what services they have at their school, and that is usually based on budget. Many of our all of our high schools in Denver have school-based health clinics that are affiliated with Denver Health, and as part of the school-based health clinic, they all come with mental health practitioners. And then we have a variety of different agencies in the community, Catholic Charities, Jewish Community and Family Services, the Maria Dross Center. We have a variety of different agencies in our community that have partnerships with schools where their therapists have office space in the school, able to provide the intensive therapy that the school wouldn't maybe otherwise have. I'm very careful to make sure that parents know that the work that I do with their students isn't therapy. Hopefully it's therapeutic, but it's not ongoing intensive therapy, but it is definitely supportive to the therapy. And then one of the things that we make sure that we do is that we like to have permission to talk with the private therapists who are working with students, so that there's alignment between what's happening in their therapy sessions and what needs to happen in school in order for us to be able to fully support those students. I believe one of the things that has been really great for us in terms of we've been doing restorative work for 11 or 12 years now, maybe even longer at our school. And one of the things that is great is as our staff have developed their skills in having restorative conversations with kids, I think our staff would say that they feel like their counseling skills have improved significantly. And so, again, that counseling isn't therapy, but it at least opens the door so that we can hopefully then link the student up to the services that they need. So in each school, it's a little bit different. I think one of the things that we're finding each year is that we could use more and more of the resources, the mental health resources, in our schools, and we're constantly advocating for that. Dwana?
I was on mute. I apologize. Thank you, Joe. This question is also for you. What are the clear distinctions between a clinical circle and a restorative circle?
Well, I think of a clinical circle as being group therapy, and group therapy is trying to think of how I would explain the clinical piece. Group therapy is very, very different than and Lindsay, jump in and help me out here in terms of how to explain the difference. But I think of a circle being around. Usually there is some kind of topic that you're discussing, and the topic sometimes may have something to do with a personal experience with something, but not necessarily. And like I said, sometimes at our school we use circles to reinforce academic content. I think of group therapy as being focused on talking about some kind of emotional difficulty that a person is struggling with, and gaining support around that particular emotional difficulty or maybe maladaptive behavior. And I don't know if I explained that very well, but in my mind, I see them as being very different, but I'm not sure that I'm explaining it.
I think that there's an intentional piece around it, that with a clinical circle or group therapy, everyone is coming in with a shared goal or objective in terms of what they're trying to achieve through going through the process. And more often than not, the circles are closed, and it might be for a certain amount of time. I know when I was doing, again, the cognitive behavioral intervention for trauma in schools, we did all of our sessions in circle and had that community building piece of it. But the end result was the creation of a trauma narrative, and it's a 10-session intervention where every week there would be a circle that was a clinical intervention.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things too that I was just thinking is that I think of a circle as being a place where people are seeking to understand, or a place where people are seeking to be understood. Mm-hmm. Whereas in a clinical group that is therapeutic, that's not necessarily the case. That a clinical group is really, and restorative does this too in terms of you want to heal the community, but a clinical group is about healing, and maybe that's the difference. The clinical group is about healing the individual, whereas the circle really is about building community and healing within the community. Now that certainly can happen in a clinical group as well, but the circle is about either seeking to understand or seeking to be understood, whereas the clinical work is more in regard to healing for the individual.
Yeah, we often say, like, while circles can be therapeutic, they are not therapy. And I think, Joe, you kind of mentioned that, something you said towards the end of the webinar as well. So we may need a little bit more clarification on this question. I'm going to ask it as it's written. How do you ensure services are appropriately assigned and there is not services overload with no impact?
So read that again, Duana, or say that again.
How do you ensure services are appropriately assigned and there are not services overload with no impact? And for whomever, I know who asked the question, if you could maybe expand upon that question a little bit so we can get it answered, that may be helpful, unless you all are able to answer it.
No, I think I need a little more detail. I need a little more detail to be able to sort that one out.
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you have another one that we can go to while?
Yes, we do. Yes, we sure do. So Joe, you talked in the beginning, you talked about the difference between empathy and sympathy, and how one of the differences was about, the power, the exercise of power. So how do we ensure that in schools we are empathizing with our young people as opposed to sympathizing with them, especially since there's already that natural power dynamic that exists in schools?
Right. So again, I think of the empathy piece is about really trying to understand what a person's experience is or has been, and that doesn't necessarily mean that we agree with whatever approach they're taking, or that kind of thing, or that we even agree with their perspective. But I think that it's about really trying to understand what, and to some degree, I guess, feel a little bit of what they might be feeling. I think with the sympathy piece, again, that is when you're just feeling, when you're feeling kind of bad about something. And obviously, I think that maybe some of that goes with empathy as well. But with sympathy, it's that, again, that power dynamic is oh, you poor thing. You're again, like I said at the beginning, you're placed by putting the person in the position of, oh, you're kind of the victim of this. And I'm above or outside of it. It ends up creating, I think, a dynamic that can end up being problematic. And one of the things that we are aware of that's tricky is that there is already a power dynamic in the schools in terms of, that the teacher's the teacher and the teacher's in charge of the class. And yet one of the things that I would say, and this isn't necessarily in regard to empathy and sympathy, but one of the things that I think is our teachers who the kids connect with the most are the teachers who they are able to maintain kind of order, and the kids are clear that they are in charge of the classroom and that kind of thing, but that they're also presenting their authentic, true selves to the kids, on a regular basis, where they are just being real, and not necessarily on a. It's not an equals level, because they're not equals, but usually in circles, we try to bring the two I'm moving my hands now, realizing people can't see them, but like try to bring the teacher down from that place of power.
The sage on the stage.
The sage on the stage, and then we try to elevate the student to a place of this is a safe place to have voice and to be able to share your voice. And I don't know that I answered that question in regard to sympathy or empathy very well, but I think it is important to be aware that we are inherently there is inherently a power dynamic that plays out in schools. And again, I think with our teachers here, we're able to, there are teachers who do a really, really nice job of equalizing themselves with the students while still maintaining, the sense of order that they need to maintain in order for their classrooms to be safe. And one of the things that's really interesting is at the end of the year, we always have our students write about what they appreciate about particular teachers. And one of the things that's interesting is that the teachers who are the favorites are the teachers whose students will identify. They'll say, she is really strict, but she is so fair. And so I think of that fairness piece as kind of, again, being kind of the that equalizing piece. But it is important to be aware that there is an inherent dynamic of power between the adults and students in a school. But hopefully through the restorative process, as students have voice, they are feeling more empowered. And that helps to, again, equalize things.
Thank you, Joe. Okay, we did get some clarification on the question from earlier. So, you all talked about a lot of available options when a young person is experiencing trauma and how to address them. So I have observed many times students are assigned and referred to too much, and there's no impact. I'm wondering how the referrals are appropriated and not overlapping.
So one of the things that we do here at our school is our support team, which is made up of our deans who are restorative but are handling the discipline, and then our restorative practices coordinators, the social work interns and myself, the prevention and intervention specialists, and our psychologists. One of the things that we do here is that we make sure that we are all in the loop in regard to what is going on with a student and who it is who is primarily serving the student. And so an example would be we have a student who lost his brother to cancer a couple years ago, and the student has he's definitely got some emotional things that come along with that loss. And the student has started to engage in some bullying behavior. And today, when the behavior was referred to the discipline office, the dean came to me to talk to me about what was going on. And so we tried to make sure that we were aligned in terms of one, what the appropriate accountability was going to be for the student, but making sure that the dean wanted to make sure that I knew that something was happening kind of from a discipline side, but then also filling the dean in on anything new that has happened from a kind of a clinical and supportive side in regard to the emotional piece of things. And so for us, it has to do with that communication. Another example is yesterday, one of our an 8th grade student who is significantly impacted with trauma. His therapist came to school yesterday to meet with me in regard to what I need to know about what's going on in the therapy and what he needs to know in regard to what's going on at school, both from an academic realm and also from the standpoint of the social emotional support that the student is getting. And so I think that I've been long-winded, but really the answer is communication, making sure that the parties who are involved are communicating, and it is important that we're not referring students to multiple services where there's a duplication of services. And that, again, and like all of the clinical services that kids get referred to at our school usually come through me or through the psychologist. And so it's kind of one person doing it. That might be different, that might be more difficult in our school has 640 kids. So that might be more difficult if there were if we were at a school that had, like 4 or 5 social workers, that kind of thing. And there have been sometimes confusions where a teacher has sent, without sending an email, an email that involves everybody, a separate email to a variety of people asking for support on the same kid. And sometimes when that happens, then there can be some messiness. But we've developed some systems here in terms of a weekly team meeting with the support staff, and then kind of just daily check-ins and regular check-ins. And our offices are all really close to each other, where we can just communicate with each other on an ongoing basis. And particularly for our students who are significantly impacted either in regard to behavior or in regard to the social emotional piece, we're talking about those kids on an almost daily basis with each other. And it may just be a 2-minute conversation, but we're having those conversations so that we make sure that we're all on the same page.
And I would just add that what 2 things came to mind for me. One is that, when we're looking at restorative and other interventions in terms of the multi-tiered system of supports, you have the universal supports that should be impactful and should help the majority of students, right? That's our 80%. And then as you go up, as long as you have those targeted, even as the prevention and intervention manual here is coordinated, then you have those more targeted supports for those students that the universal interventions are not operating as well for. And then you go up into those intensive supports that as well, when those the intermediate interventions are not doing it. And then also, Joe, you talked about this, but the importance of having the behavior implementation teams. So you having those structures in place so that all of the folks that are interacting with students in a support capacity beyond the primary teacher or educator, that they're communicating with each other to make sure that everyone is aware of all the things that are happening, and also just aware that if there is an intervention that is being assigned to a student that's not working, not just adding another thing, maybe changing the treatment plan or changing the intervention plan for that student. And then obviously some of those interventions are going to come from outside of school as well. And so just managing that balance. But again, like you said, Joe, communication being key.
Right. We have some very structured systems here at Skinner that have been really, really helpful to us. And so one of those, one of the things actually I should backtrack on too is we always, for the students who are receiving special education services, the students who are on IEPs, we always make sure that the case manager for that student is also included in the loop in regard to any supports that the student is receiving. But we have some systems in place where one of us from the support staff team is aligned with each grade level. And so I'm aligned with the 6th grade team this year. Someone else is, one of the other folks is aligned with the 7th grade team. And then one of our deans is aligned with the 8th grade team. And so they have weekly team meetings where they discuss student concerns. We go to those meetings and then we bring back from those meetings. Those meetings happen on Tuesday. And then on Wednesday morning, then we have a support staff meeting where we bring that information back to the team. Oh, there's also someone aligned with the elective teams. And so we bring all the information back to our team so that we're all getting the same information. And then on Friday mornings, we meet with our administrative team, where the support staff meet with the administrative team to make sure that they're kept in the loop in regard to things. So it's just this constant loop of coordination and constant loop of communication. And so that model has helped serve us well. We also, when we have communication with someone from the outside, so say a student is receiving private therapy through someone or some kind of service, some kind of supported service through someone, one of the things that we do is we have a designated liaison at the school. And so I'm the liaison for several kids who receive outside therapy through a private practitioner. Our dean is the liaison for other students And so we try to coordinate that as well, so that it's clear as to who's supposed to be doing the communication, so things don't end up getting wacky, where there could be a lot of splitting and a lot of confusion that happens when a lot of people are communicating about the same kiddo with a lot of different people.
Okay, thank you. Lindsay, so you talked about getting educators to be their authentic selves when engaging students, how that worked for you. So how does that actually happen, especially when some educators may not want to share parts of their life with even their coworkers, let alone the students that they teach?
Well, I mean, I think it's important that it's not obligatory that you're sharing every single part of your life, right? It's kind of a targeted sharing. So if they're, especially around your feeling, sharing your authentic self in the moment in terms of how something is impacting you in the school or in the classroom or in that specific interaction with the other person is really powerful. But there's no need to kind of disclose anything beyond what you're comfortable with, or that that you feel like it makes sense to share. I think that like as I said, for me, just sharing those feelings in that moment was impactful, but it didn't require me to disclose any trauma in my history to that student. So really, yeah, I would just say that it's sharing what you're comfortable with, but being aware of where, if you're having a resistance to being your authentic self in your day-to-day life or in your classroom, where that resistance is coming from, and spending some time on examining what that looks like as well, because I think that the resistance is probably telling you something, as is telling you that there's something going on too, because I guess it's kind of the hope that as humans, right, that we're willing to engage with each other authentically in any kind of interaction. But again, that doesn't require any overly deep sharing.
And I think it's important to be really aware of boundaries in regard to what is appropriate to share and what's not. But I think, so many of our staff members connect with our kids in regard to pets, and so like, a student sharing about, something about their dog or their cat, and then the staff member sharing about their dog or their cat, or like I have pictures in my office of, little hiking excursions that I've gone on with various staff members, and the kids will point out a picture and be like, well, where's that? And who's that in the picture? And when did you guys do that? And so I think sharing those kinds of things. I think another way, particularly for somebody who might be uncomfortable with it, there's a dinner party game called Table Talk, and with Table Talk, the concept is that you draw a card and you ask a question, and then everyone around the table answers the question. And we've adapted that, and we've created the game called Circle Talk, and it's a way for the kids to get to know each other. And when we play that, we make it really, really clear that the teacher needs to answer the question as well. And obviously, the questions are all really, really appropriate questions. And they're as superficial as what is your favorite food, to questions like, would you rather be the best player on a losing team, okay, or the worst player on a championship team? And just teachers and staff members engaging in conversations like that, where you let kids in on a little bit of a glimpse of kind of what you think and why you think it. Those kinds of conversations can be really, really powerful. I think each staff member has to kind of measure for themselves like what they feel comfortable sharing, and it's important that no one ever share anything more than what they feel comfortable with. And it's also important, conversely, that we have that same respect for the children, that we don't expect a student to express anything more than they feel comfortable with. And so again, kind of that power dynamic of don't make me talk about something that you're not willing to talk about yourself. One of the things that we do in some of our social emotional groups with some of our students who have an emotional disability, and receive mental health minutes on their IEPs in their groups. When we're talking about feelings and we do a check-in in regard to feelings, all the staff members who are in the circle during the check-in are expected to check in regard to their feelings as well. And staff members sometimes will do a great job of saying, I was really angry and frustrated during the second period because of this or because of that. And again, I think having those conversations, I think it's really appropriate for kids to experience us as human beings with the same emotions and sometimes thoughts that they sometimes have in regard to things.
And that, Joe, that just made me think of there was a school that I worked in that had a system where the teacher would, or the educator would put up a yellow, red, or green circle on their door, depending on what kind of day they were having. So if the classroom comes in and saw a red circle, they'll be like, oh, okay, Mr. So-and-so is having a rough time. We need to, keep it together a little bit more. But that was another way of sharing without necessarily going into the details of why they were feeling that way, but a way to indicate just, this is where I'm at today.
Thank you both for that. I really appreciate it. The answers to that question. I think that's incredibly important, and very powerful things can happen when adults are honest with young people about how they are feeling. So that was our last question. Lindsay, do you want to do our closing?
Yeah, actually, Joe is gonna read our closing.
Oh, Joe,
if he can find it.
Yeah,
it's on our.
I have it. All right. So our closing is: the wound is the place where the light enters you. The wound is the place where the light enters you. And that is a quote by Rumi.
Thank you, Joe. And thank you, Lindsay. And thank all of you for joining us this evening. This was an incredibly powerful webinar, some of my favorite people. And it was also our last webinar of 2018. And so we are going to be taking a holiday break, and we will return in 2019. Lindsay mentioned earlier that our first webinar, we believe it will be in February, will be about Skinner Middle School's Restorative Justice League. So about young people really leading with restorative justice in the school building and community and what that looks like. And so we will send out the dates for that. We will send out a recording of this webinar along with a new resource that we have developed. And Joe or Lindsay, if you want to include anything else that you may have mentioned, we can also send that out to people as well. So I just want to thank you both again for being with us tonight.
Thank you. And can I jump in, Dwana?
You may, of course.
Okay. Well, I have just started reading a book that I want to recommend. I hope that's okay, but it's called Trauma-Informed Treatment: The Restorative Approach, and the author is Patricia Wilcox. And I'm only a couple chapters in, but I have found it very, very powerful. And I just started reading it just a few days ago, and I found myself starting to like use the information with staff members as we've been talking about some of the concepts. And so again, the name of the book is Trauma-Informed Treatment: The Restorative Approach, and it's by Patricia Wilcox. And we'll send that to you so that you can include that in the information.
Thank you so much. Joe always has really great book recommendations. So looking forward to looking at that book. And so thank you everyone for joining us again this evening. Please be safe. Have a wonderful rest of the school year, and rest of the calendar year, and we will see you again in 2019. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Good night.